Welcome to Chuck's Creations. If you own one of these motorcycles, are thinking about getting one, or just want to know more about motorcycles in general, you're going to want to watch this video. So I'm going to do my best to start at the front and work my way back and detail a little bit about the mods and things I've done to this bike and things that I've learned along the way. Let's go ahead and get started by taking a look in the area of the front wheel. So I purchased this bike about 14 years ago with 6,000 miles on it. And one of the front calipers, which these are R1 derived calipers, not this side. Let's go to this side. I'll show you. It's got some different bolts in the caliper. There. Oh, under the reflector. The caliper was over tightened from the factory and it pulled the threads out. I did get a different caliper and I just used the different bolts that I already had for it. EBC double H centered front brake pads. I have some factory ones to replace them with when these eventually wear out. The factory ones or the EBC ones are excellent. The brakes are super sufficient for this bike being 20 years old. They were really great, but like I said, they came from the R1. And we have some gaffer brake lines. It's a great upgrade. With the older hoses on this bike, the stainless braided brake lines definitely gave the brakes a much better feel and quite a bit more control. And yes, the front wheel's a little beat up. I changed a lot of tires on this over the years, and it will be getting cleaned up and repainted on the next tire change. Let's talk about the front forks. And this is one of the best, cheapest suspension modifications that you can do to this bike. And if you look on the Fz1 forum, there's a pretty detailed description of what happens here. But basically, you disassemble, you cut the springs down, make some new spacers. I'll show you the settings up here, what that kind of looks like. It improves the front suspension greatly. Yeah, sure, it's not an Öhlins upgrade, but you know what? For $14.50, it is the best upgrade ever. And so what happens is you take the soft spot of the springs out, stiffens them up, and you overfill it with oil slightly. It creates an air cushion, really. So if you wheelie or, getting the front end light, which happens, when it comes back down, it has an air cushion before it hits the oil, which is really nice. And it improves the suspension greatly on this thing. So that is an excellent dirt cheap upgrade, which changes the bike fanatically, especially with the rear suspension upgrade, which we will get to. One more important thing here, the headlights. The factory headlights on this bike were some of the best headlights I'd ever seen on a motorcycle, and they probably still are, really. I mean, I ride quite a few bikes, and these are hard to compare. Interestingly enough, this bike's been down a couple times. I dropped it in the mountains on some ice, and before I purchased it, somebody had dropped it, and it had the factory headlight bulbs in it. It still does. I have some LED upgrades to put in it. We'll see how that works out. But I just had one low beam bulb burn out on this after 20 years. Pretty excellent. And yes, these headlights are pretty sufficient compared to all the other bikes that I ride at night. It's kind of scary, and this bike is as good as most passenger cars for the most part. Really impressive for headlights, which is one of the greatest features of this motorcycle. Even though this bike has many great surprises, the headlights are one of the best. I did put a taller windshield. I think this is zero gravity, slightly taller windshield. It's nice to have. The factory windshield's a little lower. I wanted a little more wind protection, so put the zero gravity on. The next mod we're going to be looking at are the handlebars. So these are 758 Renthals. They're double thick aluminum, and I have some bar end mirrors on the end. Without the weights, there is some vibration going through. It will numb your hands at certain speeds. I've filled them with lead before on the set that I had before this. It helps a little. It doesn't kill it. There's probably a couple more things I could do, and I'm working on this still. Did a partial restore. It's not done yet, and I'm still working on some things. The double thick aluminum handlebars are pretty nice. The 758, they're a street a street bike handlebar from Renthal. They fit this bike nicely and very comfortable. I put a double high-speed USB port here, a fast charging USB port. I had to replace this inside fairing piece, and I decided I wanted a USB port there. That was the only place I could put it because it's so large. It does have a car horn on it, which is off of a Corolla. It's almost exactly as the stock one. It is much louder, and I just needed it to pass inspection because the factory horn quit working on me. And so I just bolted that one on there, and it works quite well. I will mention that the clutch cable, throttle cables, and the switches are all original to this bike. Haven't had any issues with them. I do occasionally lube them up, probably not as much as I should, but they are doing fine. So that is something to be said for Yamaha engineering. When I originally purchased this bike, one of the first upgrades I did were LED turn signals and such. It's got some new ones on here. I use a basic like $15 electronic flasher to, make sure that they operate. I got some plastic spacers from somewhere. They will save the bike some power. We'll get to the stator here in just a second. It is kind of fragile on this bike. Anyway, the LED lights, when you have your parking lights on, or the bike's running rather, it saves you some power pulling on the stator and such. So, nope, we got us something here. The next thing we're going to talk about is there's a white connector under the gas tank, and it goes to the rectifier. And I don't think you're going to be able to see it here, but it had the melted spot. And there's another white connector coming from the actual stator under the side cover over here. And so it's this wire right here, comes up to that white connector. That one was fine. It's the next white connector up under the gas tank that had a melted spot. And cut the wire. I soldered it together because it doesn't need to come apart unless you're going to do a wiring harness or certain components are being replaced. And so that was an easy fix for it. Another thing is in this rubber booty that's up under here. You probably might be able to see the rubber booty. It's on the wiring harness. There's one wire in the middle of that. I'm assuming it carries power to the ignition switch or something. But if the bike's running, let it sit there and idle for a while. I was grabbing a hold of that wire. It was getting super hot. So it had a spade connector there, I believe. I cut it off, soldered it together. If I ever need to take it apart, I'll cut the wire. And when I put it back together, I'll solder it back together again. So it did not get hot anymore right there. And there's some sort of bottleneck of amperage happening. And so that was a good mod. Yes, all the emissions have been stripped off of this bike. See, there's plugs in the front there. They normally run over the top of the engine. I wanted a nice clean see-through on the engine. You may have noticed on my handlebars here, there is a little choke symbol, but there is no choke handle. Well, it broke off. I don't find it necessary because right here on the carburetors, you will see the slide. That is your choke. And so you can reach down with your finger and just push it. And I'd rather have that than the little handle up on the handlebars. I'm fine with not having the little knobby up there. It's okay with that. Speaking of the emissions in that system, the little servo is still up underneath here. Your bike can throw codes. Your FC1, first generation. It will come up on the tack. Even if it's running and it's throwing a code, the tack will just jump up to a certain number. I think it's 3, 4, 5, 6 or something of that nature. And that servo is one of them if the little cables are out of adjustment. Well, when I first built this bike and I was going over the dyno numbers and looking at everything, I decided on gutting my exit valve. So we're going to take a look at the exit valve. There's a cover for it down here somewhere. See if I can find it. There it is. Maybe you guys can see that. Yeah. I think that's going to be that right there. Oh. Sure. So that's where the exit valve lives. It's under that little cover right behind the kickstand there. I gutted it because they said that if you did lose any, it was very little power on the low end. The exit valve's meant to block the exhaust to give you more torque. And honestly, I didn't ride this a lot stock, but I didn't feel any difference gutting the exit valve to having the exit valve. I'm not going to suggest it, but I'll say that it was an okay modification if you're willing to go there. So I have on the carburetors here, it has an Ivan's kit. These are ported intake boots. This is a big power booster. I believe the ported intake boots combined with the proper jet kit. This little portion right here is about maybe approximately 5 horsepower of restriction. That is a great modification. When I got this kit 14 years ago, these intake boots ported were like $10 a piece. I have some and I've done some myself, but to purchase them for so little, you really can't go wrong. That's a huge power booster. I don't know as though the kit that I got is considered the full Monty kit. It has everything except for a full header system, which is worth a couple horsepower. The price of it was $1,200 back in the day. I could not justify that for a couple of horsepower when for about $150 here, probably gained 7-8 horsepower, something of that nature by modifying the carbs. This does have an airbox mod and the ported intake boots with the slip-on exhaust. Huge power difference. The delivery is great. I will say the springs and the carburetors on top for the diaphragm, they got clipped on the shortest setting, and the throttle is quite responsive and maybe even a little bit violent. I've let a few people ride this bike over the years, and some of them are pretty well experienced, and they ask me, how do I ride this bike with the throttle? But I'm used to it, and honestly, it's about the same as like a BMW with fuel injection inline 4-cylinder as far as responsiveness and how quickly it snaps to life, but it takes some people by surprise. We'll just move on to the chain and sprockets. I put a Regina chain and sprocket set on here. This is the stock gearing, which is 1644. And it tamed this bike down considerably. I've been riding it with 1545 for years and a couple other combinations. The 1644 makes it feel like a normal bike. I will say it kind of killed its cornering ability as far as getting aggressive with it because you don't have enough gears to choose from. When I originally built this bike, I put a 1545-ish gearing on it and third gear between 80 and 125 or whatever the red line was with that gearing. Complete monster in the corners. With this gearing, you know, second gear probably does 110, 15, somewhere in there. And it's hard to stay in the power where you want with this gearing. However, the RPMs are lower on the highway, which makes it a little nicer for normal riding around, which can be appreciated by many if you're not out just trying to get your adrenaline rush or be Valentino Rossi here. Yes, these are Yanni Shiki pegs. I broke off one of my factory pegs and I didn't really like them anyway. And these are great. They're for an R1. I modified the back ones with a piece of automatic transmission tube cooling line, the metal line, and made the hole the right size so that the pegs fit on the back. The front ones fit fine. And they're super light. I don't get vibration through my feet. Like the original ones have weights on the bottom to tame the vibration. Not having that problem with these. These have been on here for years. And that was a nice upgrade. To go over something important that everybody that owns one of these bikes is going to deal with at one time or another is changing the oil. The book says it holds, I think, 4.1, 4.2 quarts with an oil change. I could be wrong. I think it's 3.9 without the filter, but somewhere in that vicinity. So what happens is you fill your bike up with oil and you put the filter on and you check it and it looks good. And you take off riding and you'll be, you know, hauling ass somewhere and the oil light will come on. And it'll scare you half to death if you don't know what's going on for the first time. And the deal with this bike is the oil light is an oil level light. So if the oil gets a little bit low, the light pops on. But in this particular setup, the oil sensor was a little set up a little high in the engine. So if you do everything correctly, the oil light still comes on and scares you half to death. And so what happens is you overfill. I overfill my engine a little bit to keep the light off, and the fact that these engines, even brand new, use a little bit of oil. They're pushing a lot of performance for their day, and I'm okay with it using a little bit of oil to get that performance for sure. So I thought that was an important point that I would definitely give some people some heads up on, because when you change the oil and you look in the book and it's exactly to spec, and then the oil light comes on, it scares you half to death. So one thing to mention on these is the fuel bowl here. It does not come polished from the factory, but it is almost polished. It is almost there. And so I spent very little time and effort on this, a little bit of mother's polish, and they polish right up. And so there's not a lot of parts to polish on this bike. And at times in the middle of winter, when I first got it, I was looking for anything that I could polish on the bike. I see a lot of these, nobody does that, and it's kind of cool, you know. It's something else shiny on the bike, and a lot of new bikes, there's very little you can polish on them. Thought I would point that out as well. I have some Fz1 lowering links here. Let's see if I can show you. Yes. Somewhere in here. Has 3 holes on one end and 1 hole on the other. I have it set in the middle, which made the bike pretty low. And I rode it that way for a while. It was good for drag racing and such with my setup. But as you may be able to see up above there, this is not the factory Fz1 rear shock. This shock is off of a 2014 BMW S1000RR. And it's slightly taller, about a 1/4 inch longer, I think, than the Fz1 shock. However, with the lowering links, the way they were set up with the longer shock, the bike sits exactly how it should be sitting, really. And it has plenty of travel. It's probably just slightly lower than stock, but barely. It handles like a dream. So this BMW shock has a little bit of a weak spring for this bike, but it's pretty nice for me riding solo. The upgrade is a yellow CBR 1000RR spring. You can use an R6 spring. Again, the Fz1OA forum did have a lot of information about it. I looked and I couldn't find it real easy. Say the non-electronic shock here. What I'm curious about is if the electronic shock will fit. Can you plug it into a BMW and set the settings and then unplug it and take it off and install it on another bike? That is a good question, and I may address that later on when I find the answer to it. But these mechanical BMW rear shocks, they're great. They're equivalent to probably an expensive shock, well over $1,000 shock. I bought this as a brand new takeoff for $100 on eBay, and it makes between the front $14.50 mod and this rear BMW shock, this bike is a totally different bike. It handles superbly compared to the factory suspension. And if you're getting one of these bikes now, it is at least 16 years old, as they stopped making them in 2005. This is a definite great upgrade. So the slip-on exhaust here, this is a Delcovic slip-on. It was the cheapest, best option at the time, 14 years ago. And I'm gonna say, it does have a pretty decent sound. It's not super loud, it's not super quiet. Or the baffle for the inside of the muffler. And at this age, it quiets it down some, not like when it was new. When it was new, you could put the baffle in, it was just ever so slightly louder than the stock muffler. At this point in time, I spent, I don't know, 30, 40 bucks on the baffle, put it in there, and it quiets it down some. It definitely kills the top end power as well, big difference there. But I was hoping for it to be really quiet for whatever reason, just in case I wanted to quiet my bike down. But this is a great budget-oriented muffler. I get a lot of questions. Sometimes people look at it and they're like, whoa, your bike's getting really hot. It's turning blue right there. This muffler came colored that way. That's why I like it. That's why I got it. It's a little shorter than the stock muffler. It looks good on the bike. It has held up well over the years for sure. It still sounds great. Rear brakes, EBC, double H centered. I put about every brake pad that's name brand on the back of this bike. Bike's got, probably like 87,000 miles or something now on the frame itself. The EBC double H centered or something equivalent to that is definitely the brake to run. I use my rear brakes a fair amount, and all the other brake pads wear out very, very quickly. You want to get some quality pads on there. You'll be changing them all the time. One of the other mods is going to be this rear license plate bracket. I use the parts that the bike had, chopped the fender off and some other things, and I do bend the plate just a little bit so it's illuminated, so that the law enforcement is happy with that. But it came out pretty good. Drilled some holes for the turn signals there, and that is what the tail section, how it pretty much turned out. We can take a look. This is a stock tail light still. It has some little light cracking and such going on there, but I've got some LEDs in there that flash. I'll show them to you here in just a second. And the seat, this is a Yamaha comfort seat from the factory. It has a little spot back here. You can see the little indentation where a backrest went in, and the seat's not too bad. It's got a cover on it, Saddleman's cover. I've got some, you can see a little masking tape up here because I just painted the bike recently, and I'm wanting to get a Sargent seat for it. Haven't gotten that far yet. Still working on that. And so I'm just protecting the tank a little bit because the seat rubs into the tank pretty good. Speaking of the tank, with some tank capacity here, originally it was listed as a 5-gallon tank. I think they list it now as 5.5 gallon or something of that nature, but originally I got 5.7 or 5.8 gallons in this thing when I overfilled it. There's a mod under here where you can drill the inside of the tank where the inside of the neck goes down so that you can overfill it a lot easier and faster. I haven't done that to this bike. I just take my time, but you can overfill it quite a ways, which gets you a range. I've done some real life range of about 230 miles once out in Utah, where there's long distance between gas stations, and because this is a pretty good range for a regular sport touring bike. If you saw my video on the Goldwing, it has a 5.55 gallon tank. I think if you were riding that bike conservatively, it would compete with this in range. I think it could go 220, 230. It's a lot for a regular bike. If you don't have a monster gas tank and it's just a regular bike, most bikes struggle to get to the 200 mile mark. That was something really nice about this bike, is they gave you range, and range is good. So on the tires here, I've got some Pirelli Angel 2s, I think is what they are. It's got the 180 55 17 on it. Yeah, they're Pirelli Angel STs, and they grip like glue. This bike does not look to come loose. I haven't tested it completely. This is a fresh engine, and what I mean by fresh is somebody took very good care of the motorcycle it was in. It had very low miles. There was an incident, and I picked up the engine because my first engine, I raced a whole bunch and I accidentally damaged it. The second engine I got had the second gear problem, where it would start ratcheting in second gear, which is no good. And I waited a long time and scored a very nice low mileage engine, super snappy. That is the story with that. The cooling fan, I originally thought about putting a metal fan on it, and there's all these aftermarket parts you get for it promising to cool it off better and everything else. I left the original plastic one on here. It's original radiator. A lot of the hoses are original. I thought about replacing them. They're still in pretty good condition. This little hose right here originally ran across and hooked to the carburetors to run coolant through the carburetors to keep them warm when it was cold, keep them from freezing or at an optimal temperature. I elected to remove that system, and I do not regret it. That is another small modification that happened there, and I shortened that hose up to get it out of the way so that we could have this beautiful view that we have here. Another one of the great features of this bike from the factory is going to be the center stand. It's kind of big, it's a little bit heavy. It does you some justice. If you need to work on this thing, lube your chain, change the tire, fix the tire, a lot of these things, it is nice to have. I'll give you a picture of the sticker. Some bikes don't have the stickers. Let's just take a look at that right there. And we could talk about tire pressures, I suppose, in the back. Currently, I do air it down depending on what I'm doing, but it's probably right at 42 pounds in the front. They recommend, I think, 36 psi. Oh, it says rear 39, and then 36 and 42 depending on maximum load. I run the front close to 40-ish probably. I do air it down depending on what I'm doing, so whatever makes you feel comfortable. But here's the tire information. If you don't have that sticker may be coming off. I thought about refurbing the rear swing arm. It's original. It is still doing fine 20 years later and 80 some thousand miles. The frame sliders, these are random parts from stuff that I have laying around. You can see there's a camera mount there on the stator cover. R&G, is that an R&G? Yeah, that's R&G, it's a name brand. I believe it'll do its job. We will find out one day if it will, but maybe not, you know. It'd be nice. I've got some random one over here. Looks like a spool. It might actually be a spool. I put it on there to try to protect these covers, need be, should the time come. But to get at the stator on this bike, well, not to get at it, you can get at it right under that cover. The older engines, meaning 2001, 2002, first 2 years, and then 2003, 4, and 5, they improved the second gear shift fork, and they seem to not put the flywheel on near as tight. First couple of years, the flywheel does not want to come off, and the stator's underneath that flywheel. The deal with the stator is it's very efficient. So it uses very little power to make the power that it makes, but it's only going to make what little power it does make. So I think it's around 385 watts, somewhere in that vicinity, and it does its job. However, like I said, the LED front turn signals here, the LED headlights I'm excited to try out, and the LED tail lights, because these front turn signals are parking lights and the rear tail light has a parking light all the time. There's 2 bulbs in the back and of course 2 turn signals in the front. Turning those to LED spares the stator a little bit of constant draw. And something important to mention about that is that if you have a battery and a cell goes down or it's having a serious problem, I've learned my lesson on, with the exception of being out on the road. I rode it a little ways, but do not ride the bike if you can help it, because I've lost a couple stators. If you start working the stator real hard because your battery lost a cell or you're having a problem, it eats the stator up. It's kind of a thing with this. And so stator lives under here. It does have the original rectifier, which I may be able to show that to you here. Yeah, there's the rectifier. It's original to the bike. Still doing good. Check it out. There's like an old fire truck over here. Bago, not Bago. All right. I also always use a AGM battery, which is what it calls for. I don't get a super cheap one. I'd like to put a lithium one in there. I know that there's some electronic modifications that would have to happen with the charging system for that to operate correctly. At least I believe there is, what reading I've done. We can work on that. I've got some new grips for it and some other things. I'm definitely going to continue working on it as much as I can here and there. I've got a couple other projects going on. I hope this answered some questions, and I hope that this helps some people, and I hope that maybe some people just learn some things in general.